The fake violation, it began on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind where the neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet, as though the houses themselves were holding their breath. Rows of beige facades stretched along the cul-de-sac, their carefully trimmed hedges and symmetrical flower beds screaming conformity. The Hoa had its fingerprints all over this place, every lawn, every shade of exterior paint, every ornamental mailbox. For months, I had played along. I kept my small sedan clean, parked neatly by the curb, and paid my dues without question. I didn't make noise, didn't throw wild parties, and didn't decorate with anything louder than a seasonal wreath. In a neighborhood run by rules, I had been the perfect resident. That illusion shattered when I walked out to my car that morning. There, stuck under my windshield wiper, was a bright, neon orange slip of paper. At first glance, it looked official, block letters at the top reading, "Notice of violation," followed by a list of supposed infractions written in shaky handwriting. According to the paper, my car was parked too close to the curb, creating an eyesore and lowering property values. At the bottom, a crude signature was scrawled, "Karen, Hoa Committee." I stood frozen, staring at the slip. Something about it didn't feel right. The formatting was sloppy, the handwriting uneven, and the paper wasn't the standard white print used in official Hoa correspondence. Still, its placement on my windshield screamed authority, daring me to contest it. As I looked around, the quiet street gave me my answer. Across the way, Karen herself stood by her rose bushes, pruning them with exaggerated care. Her eyes flickered toward me, her lips curling into the faintest smirk before she pretended to focus on her clippers. Karen, self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, professional complainer, and the bane of every resident who dared deviate from her vision of suburban perfection. She wasn't the Hoa president, nor even on the official board, but she wielded her clipboard and her gossip like weapons. Her power came not from authority, but from persistence and pettiness. And now, she had set her sights on me. I removed the slip and studied it again, heat rising in my chest. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the effect was the same. It made me feel as though I'd done something wrong, as though I were an outsider who didn't belong. That was exactly what Karen wanted. All day, I couldn't shake the thought. The fake violation wasn't just a prank, it was a message. Karen had decided my car offended her delicate sensibilities, and she wanted it gone. And if I didn't comply, she'd escalate. I had seen it happen to others. The neighbor who dared paint their shutters navy blue, the family who hosted weekly soccer practices in their yard, the retired couple whose birdbath attracted pests. All had eventually caved under Karen's constant barrage of complaints, letters, and intimidation. But I wasn't like them. The more I thought about it, the more the paper in my hand transformed from a threat into a challenge. Karen had drawn a line in the sand, and she expected me to back away. Instead, a spark ignited inside me, a desire not just to resist, but to push back in a way she couldn't ignore. That night, I sat in my driveway and stared at my car. Small, unassuming, compliant. It was everything Karen wanted from her neighbors: harmless, forgettable, controlled. And suddenly, I hated it. I realized then that the solution wasn't to defend myself against her games. It wasn't to fight over slips of paper or argue with her over property lines. The answer was to do something so bold, so outrageous, that it flipped the script entirely. If Karen thought my little sedan was an eyesore, she hadn't seen anything yet. The next morning, while the neighborhood pretended to sip their coffee and mind their own business, I made a decision that would change everything. I began searching. I scrolled through listings, classifieds, forums. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but I knew the shape it was taking. Bigger, louder, impossible to ignore. And then I saw it, a photo that stopped me cold. Towering tires, gleaming chrome. A suspension that lifted the frame higher than most roofs. A monster truck, the kind you'd expect to see crushing cars in a stadium. Not parked in a suburban driveway. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was exactly what I needed. The idea lodged itself in my mind and refused to let go. Every fake violation Karen had ever handed out, every neighbor she had bullied into silence, every smug smile she flashed as she wielded her petty power, it all fueled the fire. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about sending a message she couldn't twist, ignore, or bury under paperwork. That weekend, I drove out to see the truck. Standing beside it, I felt dwarfed by its size, as though I were staring up at a mechanical beast. The tires came up past my waist, the hood higher than my head. It rumbled when the engine started, the ground trembling beneath my feet. It wasn't a car, it was a declaration. I signed the papers, without hesitation. On the drive home, heads turned, horns honked, and phones came out to capture photos. The truck didn't just demand attention, it commanded it. And I couldn't stop grinning. For the first time since that fake violation, I felt in control. By the time I pulled into the neighborhood, I could already see Karen in her yard, hose in hand, watering her precious roses. Her head lifted at the sound, her eyes narrowing, confusion flickering into horror as the shadow of the monster truck rolled across her lawn. Her smirk was gone, and that was only the beginning. Shockwaves through the neighborhood. The monster truck didn't just arrive in the neighborhood. It descended upon it like an alien spacecraft, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. The first morning it sat in my driveway, its enormous shadow stretched across the manicured lawn, spilling onto the street like a dark stain. The truck dwarfed every other vehicle around it: SUVs, sedans, even the occasional pickup. They all looked like toys beside this mechanical giant. The sound alone was enough to shake the fragile calm of the cul-de-sac. When the engine roared to life, windows rattled, birds scattered from the treetops, and neighbors peeked nervously from behind curtains. The truck didn't idle politely, it growled, its deep rumble lingering in the air long after I turned the key. Karen's reaction was everything I had hoped for. From the very first day, she positioned herself like a sentry in her yard, arms crossed, lips pinched, her gaze locked on the behemoth that now dominated the block. She scribbled furiously on her clipboard, pacing back and forth as though each note could somehow shrink the truck down to the size of my old sedan. But Karen wasn't the only one watching. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers and speculation. Some residents shook their heads disapprovingly, clutching their morning coffees with dismay. Others found themselves drawn to the spectacle, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, eager to stand near the truck's massive tires. By the second evening, a small group of kids gathered around it like pilgrims at a shrine, marveling at its size. Their laughter cut through the stiff silence Karen tried to impose. Within days, the truck became the talk of the neighborhood. Phones snapped pictures, posts appeared on community forums, and speculation spread like wildfire. Some neighbors called it reckless, an embarrassment to the integrity of the subdivision. Others whispered admiration, secretly delighted by the audacity of parking a monster truck in the middle of such a rigidly controlled community. And at the center of it all was Karen, fuming, scribbling, and plotting. The first retaliation came swiftly. A letter arrived in my mailbox stamped with the HOAS seal. Unlike Karen's crude, handwritten attempt, this one carried an air of formality. It declared that my vehicle was non-compliant with community standards, citing vague rules about oversized vehicles and aesthetic harmony. Failure to remove it, the letter warned, would result in escalating fines. But there was a problem: those rules didn't exist. I scoured the HOA bylaws, reading line by line, and found no mention of size restrictions or vehicle bans beyond commercial trucks and abandoned cars. My monster truck, absurd as it was, fell into neither category. The letter, though official in appearance, was toothless. It was bluster, likely written at Karen's urging, meant to intimidate me into surrender. I smiled as I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer. The next move was more desperate. I returned home one afternoon to find bright orange flyers taped to my mailbox, my door, even the sides of the truck. Each one bore the same message in bold letters: unsafe vehicle, remove immediately. The language was alarming, but once again, the source betrayed it. No signatures, no whole letterhead, just another amateur attempt from Karen. But this time, something strange happened. Instead of scaring me, the flyers attracted attention. Neighbors stopped to read them, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. Some laughed at the ridiculousness of it all, tearing the papers down as they passed. By trying to shame me, Karen had only drawn more eyes to the spectacle. Still, the pressure mounted. I could feel the tension thickening in the air, dividing the neighborhood into camps. On one side stood Karen and her loyal followers, mostly older residents who valued silence and conformity above all else. On the other side were those who saw the truck as more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of resistance, a middle finger to the suffocating grip of the hoe. The first real confrontation came at an HOA meeting. Word had spread, and the usually dull gathering swelled with attendees eager to witness the brewing drama. Karen seized the floor, her voice sharp and shrill as she railed against my offensive monstrosity. She claimed it endangered children, lowered property values, and disrupted the neighborhood's image. Her words dripped with venom, each sentence punctuated by a glare in my direction. But as she spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, but others rolled their eyes, whispering to one another. A few even stifled chuckles when she declared the truck an environmental hazard. For the first time, Karen's grip on the room seemed to falter. Her obsession was on full display, and not everyone shared her outrage. I sat silently, letting her fury burn itself out. When the meeting ended, people lingered, their eyes darting between me and Karen. The lines were drawn now. The monster truck wasn't just my act of defiance, it had become the neighborhood's battleground. That night, as the truck loomed silently in the driveway, I felt the weight of what I had started. Karen wouldn't stop. If anything, her obsession was growing, consuming her every move. But instead of fear, I felt a strange exhilaration. Each attempt she made only tightened the trap she had built for herself. What she didn't realize was that every action, every false violation, every angry word at those meetings was being documented. The neighborhood was watching, and sooner or later, her fury would tip into madness. For now, though, the truck stood tall, its chrome gleaming under the streetlights, a monument to defiance. Karen had thrown the first punch with her fake violation, but I had answered with something she couldn't fight, a symbol too big to ignore, too bold to erase. And as I looked out at the silent street, I knew the battle was only beginning. Escalation. The days that followed were marked by a new kind of tension, the kind that hums beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. The monster truck, parked proudly in my driveway, had become a landmark of sorts. Delivery drivers slowed down to stare, joggers paused to take photos, and children on bicycles circled it like moths to a flame. For some neighbors, it was entertainment, a rebellion to cheer from the sidelines. For others, it was a nightmare, a garish spectacle that gnawed at the order they clung to. And at the center of the storm was Karen, her frustration swelling with every passing day. She didn't bother with subtlety anymore. Each morning, I would find her outside, circling the truck like a vulture. She snapped photos from every angle, scribbled furious notes into her clipboard, and muttered under her breath as though casting curses. Her once proud rose garden now stood neglected, her obsession entirely consumed by the towering machine that blocked her view. When the flyers failed, she escalated. One afternoon, I returned home to find two uniformed officers standing beside Karen in my driveway. She was animated, her arms flailing as she pointed at the truck. Her voice carried down the street, shrill and demanding. She spoke of safety violations, of unauthorized vehicles, of community codes being broken. To the casual observer, it might have sounded convincing, but the officers, clearly weary of her tirade, approached me with measured calm. They asked routine questions, checked the truck's registration, and even walked around it once. When everything came back clean and legal, they nodded politely and left, leaving Karen fuming in their wake. Her face flushed crimson, her jaw trembling with outrage as she realized her attempt had failed. The neighbors, of course, were watching. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, and whispers spread before the police had even driven away. Karen had called in the cavalry, and she had been publicly, spectacularly denied. But humiliation only hardened her resolve. The next HOA meeting was a battlefield. Karen arrived armed with a binder bursting with printouts, photos of the truck, highlighted sections of bylaws twisted out of context, even fabricated complaints she claimed to have received from residents. She slammed the binder onto the table like evidence in a courtroom, her voice rising higher with every word. Her performance was intense, but it wasn't convincing. Too many neighbors had seen her antics firsthand, had grown tired of her endless crusades. Some still sided with her, nodding along and muttering about property values, but others rolled their eyes openly. One even asked why she cared more about my truck than her own overgrown roses. The room erupted with snickers, and Karen's composure cracked. That night, word spread faster than ever. The truck wasn't just a vehicle anymore, it was a story. Posts began appearing on social media. Photos of Karen shouting beside it captioned with mocking commentary. Neighborhood Karen versus the Beast. One read, paired with laughing emojis. Another video showed her pacing with her clipboard, dramatically pointing at the truck, her face red with fury. It was only a matter of time before the story spread beyond the block. The first real sign came when a group of teenagers from a nearby neighborhood showed up one evening, phones in hand. Eager to see the truck in person, they posed for photos, laughing and joking, while Karen stormed out of her house, screaming at them to leave. But her shouting only made the videos funnier, and by the next day, clips of her meltdown were making the rounds online. The neighborhood was officially divided. On one side, Karen and her dwindling allies, clinging to the idea that order could be restored if only the truck disappeared. On the other, neighbors who had grown tired of her reign, who saw the truck as a symbol of freedom, defiance, and most importantly, comedy. Karen, however, refused to back down. Her next move was to file a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding they issue fines and force me to remove the truck. But once again, the rules betrayed her. No matter how she twisted the language, no clause existed to justify her demands. The board stalled, unwilling to escalate without legal footing. So Karen took matters into her own hands. Late one night, long after the street had gone quiet, I awoke to the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I peered through the blinds and saw her, flashlight in hand, creeping around the truck. She crouched low, snapping photos of the tires, the plates, the suspension, as though gathering evidence for a case no one but her cared about. Her face was set in a grim mask of determination, illuminated by the pale beam of her flashlight. She looked less like a neighbor and more like a thief, skulking in the shadows of her obsession. That was when it became clear Karen wasn't just annoyed. She wasn't just angry. She was obsessed. The truck had become her entire world, the thorn she couldn't ignore, the symbol she couldn't defeat. And in her obsession, she was unraveling, one late-night patrol at a time. But the more she spiraled, the more she exposed herself. Neighbors began sharing stories of her antics, posting photos of her sneaking around at night, recounting her meltdowns at meetings. Her reputation, once formidable, was crumbling under the weight of her own fixation. And yet, something told me she wasn't finished. The police visit, the flyers, the HOA complaints, those were just opening moves. Karen was a fighter, and when fighters start to lose, they swing harder. As I watched her disappear into the shadows that night, clipboard clutched tight against her chest, I knew the real war was about to begin. The neighborhood war. Karen's late-night prowling was only the beginning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the cul-de-sac buzzed with stories of her midnight escapades. Photos of her creeping around the truck with her flashlight circulated in the community chat, paired with mocking captions. Neighbors laughed, some calling her Inspector Karen, others labeling her the parking lot police. For most people, this kind of humiliation might have been enough to back down. But Karen wasn't most people. The more the neighborhood mocked her, the harder she fought. Her next move came in the form of a petition. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, trying to rally support against the monster truck. She framed it as a matter of community pride, warning that property values would plummet if the truck stayed. But instead of gaining signatures, she found slammed doors and polite refusals. Some neighbors even told her outright that they supported me. The rejection only fueled her desperation. Soon, she stopped asking politely and started demanding. Neighbors reported her yelling on their porches, insisting they take a stand or risk the neighborhood's downfall. But the more she pushed, the more isolated she became. By the end of the week, her petition had only a handful of names, most of them her closest allies, who were already losing patience with her obsession. Still, Karen pressed on. She began flooding the whole board with daily emails, each one a tirade of complaints, photos, and exaggerated claims about the hazards of the truck. She insisted it blocked traffic, though the street was wide enough for 2 cars to pass comfortably. She claimed it leaked fluids, though the pavement beneath it remained spotless. She even alleged it attracted unwanted visitors, pointing to the teenagers who came to take photos. The board, weary of her constant badgering, began ignoring her emails. And that's when Karen's battle shifted from bureaucracy to outright warfare. One morning, I stepped outside to find toilet paper streaming from the truck's mirrors, draped across its massive tires like mocking ribbons. At first, I assumed it was the work of local kids pulling a harmless prank. But as I cleaned it off, I noticed something telling a flyer taped to the windshield. The same orange paper Karen had used before, this time reading, "The beast must go." Her handwriting gave her away. She had crossed the line from nuisance to vandal. When the neighbors heard, it only deepened the divide. Some shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how far Karen had fallen. Others openly mocked her, laughing at the absurdity of a grown woman sneaking around with toilet paper in the dead of night. But no matter how much ridicule she endured, Karen refused to stop. Her obsession became a daily performance. She staged photos of herself, pointing angrily at the truck, as though documenting a crime scene. She stood in the street yelling into her phone, loudly claiming she was calling the city to report me. She even tried to block traffic one afternoon, standing in the road with her arms spread wide until a neighbor ushered her back to her yard. And yet, each stunt only made her look more unhinged. By now, the monster truck wasn't just a vehicle parked in my driveway, it was a spectacle, a tourist attraction, even a rallying point for those who resented Karen's endless policing. Families came by on walks just to take photos. Kids begged their parents to let them stand beside the towering tires. At night, groups of teenagers posed for selfies, laughing as Karen shouted from her window. The truck had become a legend. Karen, meanwhile, had become the punchline. But humiliation didn't slow her down, it pushed her into overdrive. Late one Saturday, as neighbors hosted barbecues and children played in the yards, a commotion erupted. Karen had marched into the middle of the street with a megaphone, her voice screeching across the block. She declared the truck an abomination, warned of imminent disaster, and demanded immediate action from the community. The scene was surreal. Neighbors gathered on porches, staring in disbelief as she ranted. Some recorded her meltdown on their phones, their chuckles audible even over the screech of her megaphone. Children pointed, laughing, while others whispered in shock. Karen's tirade went on for nearly 15 minutes before her husband, red-faced and embarrassed, dragged her back inside. The videos spread instantly, making their way onto social media. By morning, Karen's meltdown had gone viral, shared, mocked, and memed far beyond the neighborhood. She had wanted the truck gone. Instead, she had made it famous. From that moment, the dynamic shifted completely. No longer was this a private neighborhood squabble. It had become entertainment for strangers across the internet. My inbox flooded with messages from people who had seen the clips, cheering me on, urging me to keep the truck exactly where it was. Some even offered donations, joking that we should build a shrine around it. Karen, however, was spiraling. The laughter, the videos, the humiliation, it all ate away at her. Her walks became angrier, her muttering louder, her glares sharper. She no longer spoke to her neighbors, no longer tended to her roses, no longer smiled her fake suburban smile. She was consumed, every ounce of her energy directed at a battle she was clearly losing. But obsession is a dangerous thing, and deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. She had tried fake violations, flyers, police, the HOA, and even public shaming. None of it had worked, which meant only one thing. Her next move would be desperate, reckless, and potentially explosive. And when it came, it would drag the entire neighborhood into chaos. Karen's last stand. The videos of Karen's megaphone meltdown spread faster than gossip in a small town. Within days, she wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance, she was internet famous. Clips of her shrieking in the cul-de-sac were stitched into TikToks, remixed with music, and turned into memes. The caption "Monster Truck vs. Mega Karen" became a viral tag. For most people, that kind of embarrassment would have been the breaking point. But Karen wasn't most people. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. Her yard, once a picture-perfect display of manicured roses and neatly trimmed hedges, became a war zone. She plastered hand-painted signs across her lawn. "Say nitrogen monoxide to the truck. Protect our neighborhood. End the noise. End the nuisance." The irony was, of course, that the truck hadn't made a single sound. It sat there quietly, gleaming in the sun, while her signs screamed louder than any engine could. Her obsession had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Neighbors began avoiding her completely. Invitations to block parties and cookouts no longer included her. Parents pulled their kids away when she stormed down the sidewalk, muttering about community collapse. Even her closest allies, the ones who had signed her pathetic petition, quietly distanced themselves. They were tired of being associated with the circus she had created. But isolation only hardened Karen's resolve. Late one evening, the sound of metal clanking echoed through the cul-de-sac. Curious neighbors peeked out their windows to see Karen dragging traffic cones and chains into the street. With shaky hands and wild eyes, she set up a makeshift barricade right in front of my driveway, as if she were laying siege to a fortress. Her plan was clear. If she couldn't remove the truck, she'd block it in. Within minutes, half the neighborhood was outside. Some shouted at her to stop. Others just recorded, their phone cameras glowing in the dark. Karen stood defiantly in her robe and slippers, sweat glistening on her forehead, her voice trembling as she declared the street closed until further notice. The absurdity of it all was undeniable. Children giggled, adults whispered in disbelief, and the cameras captured every second. But Karen's barricade didn't last long. Police cruisers rolled in, lights flashing. Called by one of the neighbors, officers stepped out. Weary and unsurprised, they already knew Karen by name after her dozens of bogus complaints. She tried to argue, waving her arms, insisting the truck was a threat to public safety. But her barricade was dismantled within minutes, the cones and chains tossed aside. The officers gave her a warning, and she was escorted back into her house, her angry shouts echoing down the block. The crowd dispersed, but the damage was done. Karen's last shred of credibility was gone. Still, she refused to let go. The very next morning, another flyer appeared, this one stuffed into every mailbox in the neighborhood. In it, Karen accused me of being a criminal, claiming the truck was illegally modified and a weapon of intimidation. She warned that anyone who supported me was complicit in destroying the neighborhood. The letter wasn't just desperate, it was slander. And this time, the neighborhood didn't ignore it. They turned against her. One by one, families began pushing back. Neighbors she had harassed for months came forward with their own stories. They shared screenshots of her angry texts, videos of her late-night trespassing, even audio of her screaming outside people's homes. The community chat, once split, now overflowed with outrage aimed not at me, but at her. Karen, who once positioned herself as the neighborhood watchdog, had officially become the neighborhood villain. And yet, in her mind, she was still the hero of the story. The breaking point came the following weekend. The cul-de-sac was alive with laughter, grills smoking, kids running barefoot across lawns. The monster truck sat in the driveway, polished to perfection, drawing admiring glances as usual. The atmosphere was festive, almost celebratory. But then, Karen emerged. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes bloodshot, her voice raw. She stormed into the street carrying a hammer, shouting that she would end this once and for all. Gasps erupted as she raised it high, aiming it at the monster truck. Before she could take a swing, neighbors rushed to intervene. Phones recorded from every angle as Karen struggled, screaming, her words incoherent. The hammer was wrestled from her hands, and police were called once again. This time, there was no warning. Karen was taken away, her furious cries fading as the squad car pulled off. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence. The reality settling in. Karen had finally snapped. And the truck, it remained untouched, standing tall and defiant, the very symbol of her downfall. That night, as the streetlights flickered and the neighborhood settled, whispers spread like wildfire. Karen's reign of terror was over. But the war she had started wasn't quite finished, because now the Hoa itself had to answer for letting her chaos go unchecked, and I was ready to make sure they did. The fallout. Karen's arrest was the kind of spectacle no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. The flashing red and blue lights, the hammer in her hand, her unhinged screaming as she was loaded into the back of the cruiser, it was all burned into the memories and the phone screens of everyone who witnessed it. Within hours, the videos were uploaded, and by morning, they had spread across the internet. The headlines wrote themselves: Karen versus Monster Truck Ends in Handcuffs. The clips racked up millions of views, and with every replay, Karen's reputation crumbled further. She wasn't the self-appointed protector of property values anymore. She was a viral punchline. And worse, her meltdown didn't just reflect on her, it reflected on the HOA. The board, already tired of her relentless complaints and demands, found themselves under scrutiny. Neighbors began demanding answers. Why had Karen been allowed to escalate so far? Why had the HOA entertained her fake violations, her petty power plays, her obsessive crusade? Emails flooded the HOA inbox. Calls were made. At the next board meeting, a record number of residents showed up, their voices sharp and angry. They weren't there to complain about lawns, fences, or parking spaces. They were there to complain about Karen and about the board's failure to rein her in. The once complacent HOA was cornered, faced with mounting pressure. The board distanced themselves from Karen, labeling her a rogue member who had acted outside her authority. But the community wasn't satisfied. They wanted accountability. They wanted change. And for the first time, the HOA had to bend. New rules were proposed, not about lawns or fences or cars, but about oversight, fairness, and transparency. The petty nitpicking that had once defined the association was put under the microscope, and neighbors who had long stayed silent finally spoke up. The board had no choice but to back down. Their authority cracked wide open, and through it all, the monster truck remained. It sat proudly in my driveway, untouched, unbothered, and more beloved than ever. Children still posed beside it, families still admired it, and strangers passing through slowed down just to catch a glimpse of the vehicle that had sparked a suburban war. For the neighbors, it wasn't just a truck anymore, it was a symbol. A reminder that one person's obsession couldn't control an entire community. A monument to standing your ground against pettiness, bullying, and abuse of power. As for Karen, her downfall was complete. After her arrest, she vanished from the neighborhood for weeks. Rumors swirled. Some said she was staying with relatives. Others whispered about mandatory counseling. When she finally returned, she was a shadow of her former self. No more flyers, no more signs, no more patrols through the streets. She avoided eye contact, kept her head down, and retreated behind drawn curtains. The once proud self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood had been reduced to a cautionary tale. Parents warned their kids not to end up like Karen. Neighbors whispered when she passed, shaking their heads at how far she had fallen. She wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't respected. She was pitied, ignored, and forgotten. The war she had started was over, but the legend lived on. Months later, I still found myself smiling whenever I saw the monster truck gleaming in the driveway, not just because it was a machine of raw power and beauty, but because of everything it represented. It had outlasted Karen's fake violations, her petty complaints, her late-night prowling, her barricades, her megaphone rants, and even her final, desperate attack. It had stood tall through it all, and so had I in the end. Karen didn't just lose her battle against me. She lost her grip on the neighborhood, her standing in the community, and her reputation across the internet. The HOA, shaken and exposed, was forced to change, and the neighbors, once divided, had rallied together not because of bylaws or property values, but because of something bigger. All because one woman tried to take down a monster truck and lost.